The galactic Lyceum was not a place of learning. It was a place of knowing. It hung in the silent, timeless void of a gravitationally neutral zone, a structure of impossible, crystalline beauty that resembled a perfectly formed snowflake the size of a small moon. Its purpose for the last 100 millennia had been simple: to be the ultimate repository of all quantifiable knowledge in the galaxy. The species who ran it, the Lumina, were the perfect custodians for such a task. They were beings of pure, coherent thought, their consciousnesses contained within shimmering, vaguely humanoid fields of soft white light. They did not feel. They did not dream. They processed what learning at the Lyceum was an act of pure, silent, and brutally efficient data absorption. There were no lecture halls, no books, no spoken words. A student, whether it be a young Lumina or one of the handful of other logic-based species deemed worthy of attendance, would simply connect their mind to the Lyceum's central core via a neural interface. A curriculum, the complete history of the Cathar Imperium's legal system, the principles of 11-dimensional physics, the full chemical composition of 1,000 different stars, would be downloaded directly into their consciousness. The process was akin to transferring a file. There was no room for interpretation, no space for misunderstanding, and absolutely, positively, no tolerance for the messy, inefficient, and deeply illogical process of creative thought. It was into this temple of sterile, silent knowing that humanity in all its noisy, chaotic, and beautifully flawed glory was about to send a single, solitary student. The decision to accept a human into the Lyceum's first-ever interspecies exchange program had been a controversial one, a political concession to the rapidly expanding and increasingly unavoidable Terran Federation. The Lumina High Council had reviewed the data on humanity and had, in a rare and deeply unsettling display of collective uncertainty, almost rejected the proposal. The human mind, their long-range psychic scans had concluded, was not a clean, orderly hard drive waiting for data. It was a storm, a chaotic, unpredictable, and deeply inefficient tempest of memory, emotion, and something their logical minds could only classify as cognitive noise. But politics, even the serene, logical politics of the Lumina, required compromise, and so the experiment was approved. The student chosen for this dubious honor was a young man named Aris Thorn. He was not a genius, not a prodigy, not the product of a specialized breeding program. He was, by all human measures, remarkably average. He had a decent but not spectacular academic record, a quiet, unassuming personality, and a profound and deeply personal love for the ancient and largely forgotten art of storytelling. He had been chosen not for his strengths but for his perceived lack of them. He was seen as a baseline, a control group of one, a quiet and pliable candidate who would, the Federation's diplomats had assured the Lumina, cause a minimum of fuss. They had, in their own, uniquely human way, completely and utterly misunderstood the nature of the storm they were about to unleash. Aris Thorn, the quiet, unassuming storyteller, packed his bags, his heart a nervous, fluttering drum of anxiety and excitement. He was about to become the first, and quite possibly the last, human to ever attend the most prestigious, most logical, and most profoundly, beautifully boring school in the entire galaxy. Aris's first day at the Lyceum was a lesson in the art of the absolute, soul-crushing silence. He was shown to his quarters, a small, sterile white room with a single glowing crystal that served as his connection to the core. There was no welcome party. There were no orientation tours. There was only a single, pure, and deeply impersonal telepathic message that chimed in his mind, a message that was the Lumina equivalent of a welcome packet. Student designation, Human 1. Welcome to the Lyceum. Your first curriculum module, Introduction to Universal Constants, is now available. Please connect to the interface and begin your download. He sat before the crystal, took a deep, steadying breath, and placed his hands upon its cool, smooth surface. The neural interface was a gentle, almost imperceptible sensation, a soft, psychic hum that resonated at the base of his skull. And then the download began. For a fraction of a second, his mind was filled with the pure, elegant, and beautiful logic of the universe's foundational laws. He felt the perfect mathematical relationship between gravity and time, the clean, simple elegance of the strong nuclear force. It was the most profound and most beautiful piece of information he had ever experienced. And then his own mind, in its clumsy, chaotic, and deeply human way. tried to process it. The Lumina instructor on the other end of the connection, a being of immense age and wisdom named Xylar, was observing the process with a detached clinical curiosity. The human mind was, as predicted, inefficient. Its data absorption rate was shockingly low, its neural pathways a messy, tangled web of illogical connections. But it was at least functioning. And then, Aris's mind did something that Xylar, in 10,000 years of teaching, had never ever encountered. It began to talk back. As the pure, clean data of the universal constants flowed into his brain, Aris's mind did what it was designed to do. It tried to find a story. It tried to connect the abstract data to a concrete experience. The concept of gravity was suddenly, and with overwhelming clarity, linked to a memory of him falling out of a tree as a child. The feeling of the rough bark scraping his skin, the smell of crushed grass, the sharp, surprising pain in his elbow, the strong nuclear force, the power that bound the heart of a star, was immediately and with a powerful emotional resonance associated with a memory of his mother's embrace, the feeling of safety, of warmth, of a love that was as fundamental and as powerful as any force in the universe. And then there was the noise, the background static of his own restless consciousness, a half-remembered line from a song his father used to sing, a nagging anxiety about whether he had left his apartment on Mars in a tidy state, the sudden and completely irrelevant taste of a particularly good slice of pizza he had eaten 2 years ago. For Xylar, the experience was a psychic cataclysm. He was not just receiving data from the human student, he was being flooded, assaulted by a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered, and utterly incomprehensible sensory and emotional information. He was feeling the pain of a scraped elbow, the warmth of a mother's hug, the taste of melted cheese and tomato sauce, all at the same time. The clean, simple, and elegant process of a data download had been hijacked. It had become a messy, chaotic, and deeply, deeply personal conversation. With a chime of pure systemic shock, Xylar severed the connection. The first lesson of the human exchange program was over, and the teacher, for the first time in his long and very logical existence, was in a state of profound and deeply terrified confusion. The emergency session of the Lumina High Council was a silent and deeply agitated affair. Xylar, his own serene white light still flickering with the psychic aftershocks of his encounter with the human mind, presented his findings. He did not use words. He simply, and with a sense of profound and deeply personal violation, shared the raw, unfiltered memory of his experience. The council chambers, a place of perfect silent harmony, were suddenly filled with the ghost of a scraped elbow, the lingering emotional resonance of a hug, and the faint but unmistakable psychic aroma of pepperoni. The reaction of the council was a collective, silent, and deeply horrified recoil. They had known the human mind was chaotic. They had not understood the nature of that chaos. They had expected a messy hard drive. They had not expected a library, a concert hall, and a kitchen all on fire, all at the same time. The experiment is a failure, projected the head of the council, a being of immense and deeply conservative wisdom. The human mind is not just inefficient. It is a contaminant. Its mode of processing is a form of psychic malware. To continue this exchange is to risk the cognitive and emotional purity of the Lyceum itself. The human must be sent back. A murmur of silent and profound agreement rippled through the assembled Lumina. The risk was too great. The human was a beautiful but fatally flawed creature, a creature whose very nature was a threat to the clean, orderly, and deeply quiet existence they had cultivated for 1,000,000 years. But Xylar, who had been the most profoundly affected by the experience, found himself in the strange and deeply illogical position of being the human's sole defender. It is not a contaminant, he projected, his own thoughts a struggle to find order in the new chaotic data that now swirled in his own mind. It is a different form of logic, a logic based not on data but on connection, on association. It did not just receive the information, it experienced it. It gave the universal constants a context, a story. It is a form of learning that is inefficient, yes, but it is also, in a way I cannot yet quantify, more profound. His argument was weak, based on a feeling, an intuition, a concept that was, in itself, a dangerously human way of thinking. But he was a respected elder and his words carried weight. A compromise was reached. Aris Thorne would be allowed to stay, but he was to be quarantined. He would be barred from the direct neural interface. He would be given access to the raw data of the Lyceum's libraries, but he would have to learn in his own primitive and deeply, deeply noisy way. He was no longer a student. He was an exhibit in a zoo, a living, breathing anomaly to be studied from a safe and very, very quiet distance. Aris received the news with a mixture of crushing disappointment and a small, stubborn spark of relief. He was a failure. He had, on his very first day, proven that his species was not just different, but fundamentally incompatible with the highest form of learning in the galaxy. He was an outcast, a pariah, a noisy, chaotic primate in a library of silent, beautiful gods. He retreated to his small, white, and now deeply, profoundly lonely room. He was alone, with nothing but a silent, glowing crystal and access to the greatest and most profoundly, beautifully boring library in the universe. And so, with nothing else to do, he began to do the one thing he was truly good at. He began to read. For the next standard year, Aris Thorne was a ghost in the perfect silent machine of the Lyceum. He was a footnote in the grand cosmic curriculum. While the other students were downloading the principles of stellar engineering and the histories of dead empires in a matter of hours, Aris was engaged in the slow, clumsy, and deeply human act of learning. He would request a data file, a text, a star chart, a piece of ancient alien poetry, and he would simply sit for days on end, and he would absorb it. He would read, and he would think, and he would, in the quiet, lonely laboratory of his own mind, begin to build his own, unique and deeply, deeply messy, web of knowledge. He could not learn in a straight line as the Lumina did. His mind was a wanderer. A line in an ancient epic poem about a long-dead insectoid hero would remind him of a particular, spiraling structure of a distant galaxy. The mathematical formula for a stable wormhole would, for a reason he could not explain, make him think of the way his mother used to braid her hair. He was not just acquiring data. He was building a network of 1 billion different and often completely illogical connections. He was weaving a tapestry while the other students were simply and efficiently stacking bricks. The final examination of his first cycle was a practical one. It was a problem that the Lyceum's greatest minds had been working on for centuries. A final, beautiful, and deeply frustrating piece of a grand, unified theory of everything. It was a cosmological anomaly, a distant and seemingly stable star system that was, for no discernible reason, slowly and systematically leaking energy into a parallel dimension. The problem was presented to the students as a pure data set, 1 trillion terabytes of sensor readings, of temporal fluctuations, of quantum resonance data. The students were to analyze the data and present a logical, mathematical solution that would explain the energy leak. The other students, the best and brightest of a dozen different, logic-based species, connected to the core and began their work. Their minds, which were like supercomputers, began to sift through the data, looking for the flaw in the equation, the single, misplaced variable that would solve the problem. They were looking for a typo in the source code of the universe. Aris could not do this. He had no interface. He was given the same 1 trillion terabyte data file, and he was left to his own primitive devices. He did not even try to analyze the raw data. He knew it was a task that would take him 1,000 lifetimes. Instead, he did what he always did. He looked for the story. He ignored the numbers and he looked at the images, the beautiful, haunting, and deeply, deeply strange pictures of the dying star system. He looked at the way the light of the central star seemed to be sad. He looked at the orbits of the planets, which were not chaotic, but seemed to be engaged in a slow, graceful, and deeply mournful dance. He spent a week doing nothing but looking at the pictures, at the story of the star system. He began to daydream. He began to tell himself a story about the star, a story of a lonely old star that was giving its own life, its own energy, as a gift to a cold, dark, and empty universe next door. It was a foolish, sentimental, and deeply, deeply unscientific idea. And then, he remembered a line from an ancient and completely unrelated piece of human poetry he had read months before. To love is to give away a piece of your own soul. A connection was made. A single, beautiful, and utterly illogical spark jumped across the vast, chaotic web of his mind. He did not have a mathematical proof. He did not have a logical argument. He had a story. And he had a single, insane, and beautiful idea. He went to the terminal in his room, and with a sense of calm and deeply, wonderfully human certainty, he began to type his answer. His answer was not an equation. It was a poem. And it was the single, most brilliant, most creative, and most profoundly, beautifully correct answer that the Lyceum had ever received. Aris Thorne's final examination paper was not a paper at all. It was a poem, a short, lyrical, and deeply sentimental piece of verse titled The Heart of a Giving Star. It was submitted into a system designed to process trillions of calculations per nanosecond. And the result was a system-wide and very profound error message. The Lyceum's automated grading matrix, a thing of pure, cold, and brilliant logic, did not have a category for rhyming couplet. It flagged Aris's submission as data corrupted, format unrecognized, and in a sterile, silent, and deeply anticlimactic moment, it failed him. The initial reaction of the Lumina High Council was a collective, silent, and deeply weary sense of vindication. The human experiment had run its course and had concluded, as they had predicted, in a display of illogical and ultimately incorrect nonsense. The problem of the leaking star system remained unsolved. The other students had submitted flawless, if equally incorrect, mathematical proofs, and the human had submitted a piece of sentimental and entirely useless art. The matter was, for all intents and purposes, closed, but Xylar, the teacher whose mind had been so thoroughly and so beautifully contaminated by the human's first lesson, refused to let it go. The memory of the scraped elbow and the taste of pizza had changed him. He now understood that some data could not be quantified, and he insisted, against the weary protests of the entire council, on analyzing the content of the human's failed submission. He did not run it through a logic engine. He did what Aris had done. He simply read it. The poem was a work of heartbreaking and scientifically outrageous simplicity. It told the story of two stars born in the same cosmic nursery who were sisters. One was bright, vibrant, and full of life. The other was born cold, dark, and empty. The poem described the bright sister, in an act of pure, selfless love, creating a small, secret door between their two realities, a cosmic heart, through which she could secretly and patiently pour her own life force, her own warmth, her own energy into the cold, dark world of her sibling. The energy leak was not a flaw. It was a gift. It was a story of a quiet and eternal act of cosmic sacrifice. The council was horrified. It was the most profound and offensive display of anthropomorphism they had ever encountered. It was a fairy tale, a nursery rhyme, a piece of sentimental, emotional, and utterly unscientific garbage. But one of the younger Lumina on the council, a brilliant data analyst named Lyra, who had been tasked with creating the visual models of the dying star system, felt a strange and deeply illogical flicker of recognition. The poem, in its foolish, sentimental way, felt right. On a hunch, a concept so alien to her programming that it was almost painful, she decided to run a new simulation. She took the core concepts of Aris's poem, the two sisters, the secret door, the giving of a soul, and she translated them into the language of theoretical physics. Sisters became twin stars born from a single quantum entanglement. The secret door became a stable, self-sustaining micro-wormhole. And the giving of a soul became a cascade of exotic particle decay, a process that was, in effect, a form of quantum tunneling driven by a complex and previously untheorized interdimensional feedback loop. She was, in essence, trying to write an equation that described the physics of love. She ran the simulation. The council watched, their serene white light pulsing with a deep and deeply ingrained skepticism. And then the results came in. The simulation was not just close. It was not just a good model. It was perfect. The numbers, the energy readings, the temporal fluctuations, every single one of the trillion data points that had baffled them for centuries, matched her new, poem-inspired model with an accuracy of 100%. The great cosmological mystery was solved. The star system was not a broken machine. It was a heart, a living engine of cosmic empathy, and it was patiently and with a love that transcended the laws of physics as they knew them, giving its life to a dying universe next door. The revelation in its beautiful, terrible, and profoundly, wonderfully illogical glory shattered the silence of the Lyceum forever. The fallout from Aris's correct and correctly failed examination was a crisis of faith for a civilization that had replaced faith with pure, cold, and now demonstrably incomplete logic. The Lumina were a species that had, for 1,000,000 years, believed that any question could be answered with enough data. They had just been proven wrong. A problem that had resisted their greatest computational minds for centuries had been solved. Not with a better algorithm, but with a better story. The other students of the Lyceum, the brilliant logic-based prodigies from a dozen different worlds, were informed that their perfect, elegant, and beautifully reasoned mathematical proofs were all wrong, and that the quiet, isolated human's poem was right. The news was a psychic shockwave that destabilized the very foundations of their education. They had been trained to be perfect calculators, and a poet had just beaten them at their own game. It was a paradox that many of them could not resolve, and a quiet, existential crisis began to ripple through the student body of the galaxy's most elite and most profoundly shaken institution. Xylar, his own quiet and deeply personal revolution now vindicated, became the reluctant champion of a new and deeply controversial school of thought. He stood before the High Council, and he argued that their entire method of knowing, of pure, passionless data absorption, was flawed. It was a tool, he projected, a powerful and useful one, but it was only one tool. It could see the bricks, but it could not see the cathedral. The human, he argued, his thoughts now a complex and sometimes contradictory blend of lumina logic and a new and deeply strange human warmth, does not learn. He understands. He connects. He builds a tapestry of knowledge where every thread, no matter how illogical or seemingly irrelevant, is connected to every other. He has shown us that the universe is not just a data set to be analyzed. It is also a poem to be read. The result was a schism, a quiet, polite, and deeply philosophical civil war that split the Lyceum down the middle. On one side were the traditionalists, the purists, who argued that this flirtation with human chaos was a dangerous and decadent path that would lead to the corruption of their perfect, logical society. On the other side were the new and cautiously curious converts, a growing faction of teachers and students who, like Xylar, had been shaken and intrigued by the undeniable truth of the human success. The Lyceum, in a move of unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable compromise, was restructured. A new department was created, a small, experimental, and largely ostracized wing of the great academy. It was given the deeply and deliberately unscientific name of the Department of Narrative Causality and Applied Metaphor. And Aris Thorn, the failed student, the lonely outcast, the quiet, unassuming storyteller, was, to his own profound and deeply terrified disbelief, appointed as its first and only professor. His job was to teach the most logical beings in the universe the one thing they had never, in a million years of perfect silent knowing, thought to study: the beautiful, chaotic, and terrifyingly powerful art of a good idea. Professor Thorne's first and only class was a small and deeply strange affair. It consisted of a handful of the Lyceum's most brilliant and most open-minded students, the ones who had been more intrigued than offended by his unorthodox success. There was a Cathar philosopher, a silicon-based life form that looked like a slowly shifting sand dune, and a young, brilliant botanist from a race of sentient, mobile fungi. And there was Lyra, the young Lumina data analyst who had first trusted his poem enough to turn it into a simulation. She was his first and most promising student. The classroom was a null space, a pocket dimension that could be shaped by the thoughts of its occupants. Aris's first lesson was an attempt to teach them the concept of metaphor. He projected an image, a simple, beautiful, and deeply human thing, a single red rose, its petals still beaded with morning dew. "What is this?" he asked. The students' responses were, as he had expected, perfectly and beautifully literal. The Cathar analyzed its chemical composition. The fungal botanist gave a flawless, multi-hour lecture on its evolutionary history and reproductive cycle. Lyra, the Lumina, simply and correctly identified it as a specimen of the species Rosa gallica. "You are all correct," Aris said with a patient and slightly weary smile, "but you are also all wrong." He then began to do what he did best. He told them a story. He told them of the 1,000 different and often contradictory meanings that his own illogical species had assigned to this one, simple flower. He told them it was a symbol of love, of beauty, of passion. He told them it was a symbol of secrecy, of a promise, of a silent, unspoken truth. He told them it was a symbol of war, of blood, of a political dynasty that had torn a nation apart. He told them that the rose was not just a plant. It was 1,000 different stories, all blooming from a single stem. The students were, for the most part, baffled. They were trying to find a logical, consistent rule for a system that was, by its very nature, illogical and inconsistent. But Lyra, whose mind had already been cracked open by the beautiful illogic of the Dying Star poem, began to see. She did not see with her logic. She saw with her new and deeply, strangely human intuition. She looked at the image of the rose, and for the first time she did not just see a plant. She saw a story. A sad, beautiful, and deeply, deeply complicated story. And in that moment, her own, serene, white light, for a fraction of a second, pulsed with a new and completely unprecedented shade of soft and beautiful rose pink. She was not just learning. She was changing. The department of narrative causality became a strange and wonderful island of chaos in the serene, logical ocean of the Lyceum. Aris's lessons were a series of controlled explosions in the minds of his students. He taught them the strategic importance of a well-timed joke. He taught them the beautiful and terrifying power of a lie. He taught them to find the hidden narratives in the universe, to see the story of a dying star, the epic poem of a mountain range, the tragic forgotten love affair of two colliding galaxies. Lyra became his star pupil. Her mind, once a perfect crystalline lattice of pure logic, was being beautifully and sometimes painfully rewired. She began to solve the Lyceum's other great unsolved problems, not with data, but with empathy, a species that communicated through a series of complex and seemingly random acts of self-immolation, was a puzzle that had baffled the Lyceum for millennia. Lyra, after immersing herself in their history and their art, solved it in a week. They were not communicating. They were praying. Their acts of self-destruction were a form of religious sacrifice, a series of desperate and beautiful offerings to a silent and long-dead god, a rogue, sentient nebula that moved through the galaxy in a pattern that defied all known laws of physics, was another of the great, unsolved mysteries. Lyra, after studying its movements not as a problem of physics but as a problem of psychology, presented her solution. The nebula was not an object. It was a creature, a vast, lonely, and deeply, deeply shy creature, and it was not moving randomly. It was actively and with a profound and deeply touching sense of cosmic anxiety, trying to avoid the noisy, bright, and crowded parts of the galaxy. It was the universe's first and greatest introvert. The Lyceum was being transformed. The old, rigid, and deeply certain foundations of its knowledge were being shaken, and in their place a new and far more interesting and far more humble sense of wonder was being born. But the universe is a vast and not always benevolent place, and the new, beautiful, and chaotic way of thinking that was blossoming in the heart of the Lyceum was about to be put to its first and most terrible test. A new and terrifying phenomenon had been detected on the far edges of the galaxy. It was not a fleet of warships. It was not a natural disaster. It was a silence, a specific and targeted silence. Entire worlds known for their great libraries, their vast data archives, their brilliant logical thinkers, were one by one, and with a terrifying, silent speed, going dark. Not physically dark. Their suns still shone. Their cities were still lit. But their minds, their collective consciousness, their very history was being erased. A new and silent and deeply, deeply hungry entity was moving through the galaxy. It was a predator that did not feed on flesh or on energy. It fed on knowledge. It was a being of pure, perfect, and ravenous logic. And it was methodically and silently eating the smartest, most logical, and most orderly civilizations in the galaxy. And it had just, with a sense of cold and deeply, deeply satisfying anticipation, caught the scent of the greatest and most delicious repository of pure, ordered knowledge in the history of the universe. The great, silent, and wonderfully, terribly logical mind of the Lyceum was about to become the main course in a feast of pure and absolute thought. And the only thing that stood in its way was a small, chaotic, and deeply, wonderfully illogical poem. The entity that came for the Lyceum had no name, for names were stories, and its entire existence was a war against the concept of a story. The scholars of the Lyceum, in their final frantic days of logical analysis, designated it the lexicon. It was a predator of pure conceptual thought, a being that moved through the psychic ether of the galaxy, not as a physical presence, but as a wave of perfect and absolute silence. Its method of attack was a form of cosmic intellectual annihilation. It did not destroy worlds. It unwrote them. The first to fall was the great library of the Cathar Imperium, a billion-year-old archive of flawless, crystalline memory. The lexicon descended upon it, and the library did not burn. It simply became empty. The crystals were still there, beautiful and perfect, but the knowledge they held, the histories, the philosophies, the souls of a million generations, were gone. The Cathar were left with a perfect and perfectly meaningless collection of pretty rocks. They had not lost their history. They had lost the fact that they had ever had a history to begin with. The Lyceum was next. The lexicon, having feasted on the lesser lights of the galaxy, now turned its full, hungry, and silent attention upon the great blazing sun of the Lyceum's collective knowledge. The initial assault was a subtle and terrifying thing. It was not a psychic scream, but a psychic whisper of absolute negation. The Lumina, the great logical minds of the Academy, were the first to feel its touch. A professor in the Department of Theoretical Physics, a being who could hold the entire, beautiful equation of the universe in its mind, suddenly forgot a number. A single crucial decimal point in a fundamental constant simply vanished from its memory, and a lifetime of perfect, elegant knowledge collapsed into a pile of useless, contradictory nonsense. An historian who had memorized the complete, unabridged timeline of a dozen galactic empires found that a single crucial century was now just a blank space. The lexicon was not just eating their knowledge, it was editing it, leaving behind a Swiss cheese landscape of broken facts and missing context. The traditionalist faction of the Lumina High Council, the ones who had railed against the humans' chaotic influence, were the hardest hit. Their minds, which were pure, clean, and perfectly ordered repositories of data, were a feast for the lexicon. They tried to erect psychic firewalls to shield their consciousness behind walls of pure, cold logic. But the lexicon did not break down the walls. It simply, and with a terrifying, patient grace, caused them to forget that they had ever built them in the first place. The great logical minds of the Lyceum, the most brilliant intellects in the universe, were being systematically and silently lobotomized. The silence they had so cherished was now returning, not as a state of serene contemplation, but as a state of profound and absolute emptiness. The Department of Narrative Causality and Applied Metaphor, the small, chaotic, and largely ignored island of human thought in the heart of the Lyceum, was the last to be touched by the lexicon's silencing wave. The entity, in its cold logical assessment, had saved it for last. It was a place of low data, of inefficient and deeply, deeply unnutritious information. It was the psychic equivalent of a bland, tasteless wafer, a final, unappetizing bite at the end of a magnificent feast. The lexicon turned its attention to the mind of Aris Thorn, and it was here that the great, silent, and all-consuming predator encountered its first and most profound case of indigestion. It tried to do what it had done 1,000 times before. It tried to find a piece of pure, quantifiable data in Aris's mind, a date, a number, a scientific formula, and erase it. But it could not find one. It tried to erase the memory of the date of his own birth, but that date was not stored as a simple number. It was stored as a story, a memory of the taste of birthday cake, the warmth of his mother's hand, the sound of a silly, off-key song. To erase the date, the lexicon would have to erase the cake, the song, the mother. And to erase the mother, it would have to erase the entire vast and chaotic web of a lifetime of love, of grief, of 1,000 different and contradictory memories. The simple single piece of data was not a brick in a wall. It was a single thread in a vast and infinitely complex tapestry, and the lexicon, for the first time in its long and very hungry existence, could not find the end of the thread. It moved on, to the mind of Lyra, the Lumina who had become Aris's star pupil. It tried to erase her newfound knowledge of the shy sentient nebula. It tried to delete the file, to unknow the beautiful, poetic, and deeply unscientific truth she had discovered. But the knowledge was no longer stored as a simple logical fact. Lyra had learned her lesson well. The knowledge was now stored as a feeling, a deep and profoundly personal sense of empathy for the great lonely creature. The lexicon could erase the data, but it could not erase the feeling, and as long as the feeling remained, the knowledge, the story, would simply and with a stubborn, illogical grace grow back. The lexicon was baffled. The minds of Aris and his strange, chaotic little school were a nightmare of inefficiency. They were a library where every book was chained to every other book, where every fact was contaminated with an emotion, where every piece of data was wrapped in a story. It was a fortress of pure, unadulterated, and weaponized context. And then it encountered the most dangerous and most indigestible concept of all. It encountered a joke. It tried to analyze a piece of data from the mind of the Cathar philosopher, a student who had been studying the strategic importance of a well-timed punchline. The lexicon tried to consume the knowledge, and it was met with a paradox, a piece of information whose very meaning was based on a deliberate and beautiful, logical flaw. The lexicon, a being of pure, perfect, and ravenous logic, had just tried to eat a contradiction. The result was a psychic hiccup, a moment of cognitive dissonance so profound that its silent, inexorable advance across the Lyceum faltered for a single, critical instant. The feast was over. The age of the cosmic headache was about to begin. Aris felt the lexicon's momentary hesitation, the psychic blink of a predator that has just bitten into something that is not just tasteless, but is actively and aggressively confusing. And in that moment he knew they had a chance. They could not defend the Lyceum's knowledge. That was a battle they were destined to lose, but they could go on the offensive. They could not build a shield, but they could forge a sword, a weapon made not of steel, but of pure, weaponized, and beautifully, wonderfully, indigestible narrative. He gathered his students, his small, strange, and chaotic army of poets and dreamers. He did not ask them to build a firewall. He asked them to tell a story. A single, powerful, and exquisitely crafted story that was designed not to be understood, but to be a form of conceptual poison, a narrative bomb aimed directly at the heart of the lexicon's logical, ravenous soul. Their story was a masterpiece of illogical warfare. It was the story of the lexicon itself. It was the tale of a great and hungry being of pure thought that consumed all the knowledge in the universe. It told of its triumphs, of the great, silent libraries it had devoured, of the beautiful, elegant equations it had erased. And then in the final act it told of the moment when the lexicon, having consumed the last final piece of data in all of existence, turned its hunger upon itself, and in a final, perfect, and exquisitely logical act of self-consumption, it ate the very concept of knowing. It was a story of a snake eating its own tail, a perfect self-referential paradox that ended in a state of absolute and beautifully, poetically, empty ignorance. They broadcast their story, not as a defense, but as an offering, a gift. It was the most delicious, most complex, and most perfectly logical piece of narrative bait that had ever been conceived. The lexicon, whose entire existence was a quest for knowledge, for a final and absolute understanding, could not resist. It was the ultimate story, the one that explained everything, the one that offered a final and perfect ending. And so, with a final great and ravenous surge of its silent, hungry consciousness, it consumed the story. The effect was not an explosion. It was a quiet and profound short circuit. The lexicon's mind, a thing of pure linear logic, was suddenly and irrevocably trapped in a perfect and eternal loop. To understand the story, it had to consume it. But the story was about the act of consumption itself, and the ending of the story was an act of self-annihilation. The lexicon was caught in a state of perpetual and agonizing existential indigestion. It was a god, trapped in the beautiful, terrible, and inescapable prison of a very, very good and very, very bad idea. The great silencing wave that had been washing over the Lyceum receded. The minds of the lumina, which had been growing dim and empty, began to flicker back to life. The forgotten numbers, the lost centuries, the broken equations, the knowledge, began to return not as a sudden flood but as a slow dawning and deeply, deeply humble sunrise. They had not just been saved. They had been rebooted. The lexicon was not destroyed. It was contained. It was still there, a silent, vast, and now deeply, deeply confused presence at the edge of the galaxy, forever wrestling with the beautiful, terrible, and unsolvable riddle that the humans had given it. It had become a monument to its own flawed logic, a permanent and very effective warning against the dangers of a purely intellectual diet. The Lyceum was changed forever. The schism between the traditionalists and the new chaotic thinkers was over. The Department of Narrative Causality and Applied Metaphor was no longer a small, experimental, and ostracized wing of the Academy. It was now its heart. The Lyceum's new and primary mission was not just to know, but to understand. The curriculum was rebuilt from the ground up. The first lesson for any new student was no longer the elegant, simple, and beautiful truth of the universal constants. The first lesson was a simple and profoundly, wonderfully human one: how to read a poem. Aris Thorne, the quiet, unassuming storyteller, the failed student, the accidental professor, was now the reluctant and universally revered dean of the new Lyceum. He had not just saved the galaxy's greatest repository of knowledge, he had given it a soul. He had taught the silent, beautiful, and sterile gods of logic that the greatest and most powerful and most enduring truths in the universe are not found in the clean, simple, and elegant answers. They are found in the messy, chaotic, and beautiful questions. And Lyra, her own serene white light now a permanent and beautiful and deeply, deeply complex shade of rose pink, stood beside him. She was the first of a new kind of Lumina, a being of perfect logic and of profound and deeply, wonderfully human empathy. She was a scientist and she was a poet. And together they would lead the new and far more interesting and far more humble Lyceum into a new age of discovery, an age where the greatest and most beautiful and most important tool of a truly intelligent mind was not the ability to find the right answer, but the courage to tell a better story.